What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, hour number 3. We're going to close the phone lines for a little bit here and talk to the lovely lady Claire. And Claire, what's the first thing you want to talk about?
Well, the first thing I want to talk about is something which, of course, is not being covered at all on the prostitute media, shall we just call it what it is. And apparently, Italy is having this humongous banking crisis. And this is why it's gone off the radar. It's almost so serious that the worse it gets, the less we hear about it. And investors and voters might get spooked, and Italian elections are coming up very quickly. But there was a very interesting article through Zero Hedge that was published in the financial section of the Italian daily Il Sole, and it talks about how serious the situation has become. According to new research by Italian investment bank Mediobanca, 114 of the close to 500 banks in Italy have what are called Texas ratios of over 100%. Now, this ratio is calculated by dividing the total value of a bank's non-performing loans by its tangible book value plus reserves, or as American money manager Steve Eisman put, all the bad stuff divided by the money you have to pay for all the bad stuff. And this is really nasty because the only question that comes to mind is if there's a default on these banks, Mike, will the EU and IMF be able to bail Italy out without invoking the extreme financial austerity on the English people, as happened when the Cyprus banking system fell apart, and also Greece?
Yeah, Greece. Greece. The demands made by the ECB on Greece are simply unattainable. Yeah. But the attitude of these money junkies is, we don't care. Work your people to death. Give us all the money, and even then we won't be happy. Yeah,
you know, it seems to be reaching this critical point of not being able to be saved. You know. Okay. And one has to wonder who's going to, if it's going to be Iexit or Frexit next.
Well, if looking at the massive amounts of election fraud that we're already seeing in the European elections, the EU is going to fight this tooth and nail. We could even see the EU literally launch a war to reconquer these departing provinces. And they would probably cite the American Civil War as their historical justification. Whoa. But again, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of these EU member states do have a right to self-determination.
Yeah. It's insane. There was a very interesting observation with NBC about Obamagate and Trumpgate, Russiagate, and apparently confirming the incriminating remarks from former Obama Deputy Secretary of Defense, Evelyn Farkas, on the mad scramble by the Obama administration to collect and preserve intelligence on alleged Russian election hacking before Obama left office. NBC is reporting that a former Obama official admits they made a list of Russian probe documents to keep them safe. And, Mike, all I can think, it appears toward the end that the DNC knew that they had their bet on the losing horse, and at the end of the day had to find someone to blame it on.
Well, I'm sure that's a side effect here, but, you know, we're now getting indications that the spying on Trump went back to before he'd even won the nomination. Yeah. And so we're back in Watergate territory. Obama was using the security apparatus of the United States of America to spy on the Trump campaign and was apparently sharing the information all over the place with any Democrat who was interested, or even the never-Trump Republicans were getting this material. And it's not Watergate 2. It's actually worse than Watergate. And I imagine somewhere Richard Nixon is kicking back and smiling that he's no longer going to be seen as the absolute most corrupt president in American history.
Yeah.
Let me make one thing perfectly clear. I accept the responsibility, but not the blame.
Another thing that we need to take a look at and be aware of, apparently Venezuelan bonds have crashed as the political situation in that country has turned explosive. The bonds crashed today as a result of political tensions after the annulment of the country's legislation legislature by its high court on Wednesday, a move that ignited, tons of protests, invoked international condemnation, and prompted opposition to call for a military response to what seemed to be a coup by Maduro. And he is apparently attempting to seize unilateral control of the government and isolate the opposition. This could get nasty very, very quickly.
Well, that opposition, of course, is U.S.-backed and U.S.-funded, and the U.S. has been waging covert war, an economic war against Venezuela, going all the way back to Hugo Chavez, because Venezuela dares to spend the taxpayers' money on the taxpayers and sells their oil for whatever currencies they want. And that sets a bad example for the rest of the world. We only tolerate governments that grind their people into the dirt and give the money to the bankers.
Yeah, yeah.
We're going to do a quick shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just rejoining our network. We're talking with the lovely Lady Claire for our weekly clarification, and we're talking about North Korea.
And in Europe, SecDef Mattis said North Korea has got to be stopped. And he made the observation, right now, North Korea appears to be going in a very reckless direction, and that has got to be stopped. Now, he didn't give any details about how the United States is going to do this. And
well, he didn't give any details about what North Korea is doing. And I love the way that he says that North Korea is thumbing their nose at the international community. And again, it shows that Matisse is on board with the globalists here. Now, again, as we had a caller in the last hour, it made it very clear. North Korea's desire for nuclear weapons is as a deterrent. When the United States was spending huge amounts of taxpayer money building our nuclear arsenal, it was always say, so nobody will feel that they can attack us with impunity. Yeah. And the same thing is true for North Korea, or for that matter, Iraq. If they'd had nuclear weapons, or Iran, if they get nuclear weapons, they're not going to launch a first strike, because the result would be national suicide. Yeah. The reason to have nuclear weapons is to discourage other countries from invading you by saying it'll be more costly than it's worth to steal our country from us. And again, in all of history, the only nation to ever actually use nuclear weapons of mass destruction against civilians of another country is the United States. And so they really do not have standing to be screaming about other countries' nuclear weapons and what they may do with it.
And as you mentioned, there's going to be a meeting between President Xi Jinping of China and President Trump in Florida next week. And SecDef Mattis, a word, please. I would like very much to see you talk with your Chinese counterpart about getting North Korea back to the negotiating table, along with South Korea and Japan, to hammer out a peace treaty to replace the existing armistice, with the proviso that in order for that to happen, North Korea has got to abandon its nuclear weapons program.
I think North Korea would probably go along with that because the only North Korea doesn't really have the money to be developing nuclear weapons.
No.
They're only doing it because they're constantly seeing all this threat of invasion from the south, invasion from the ocean, invasion from the north. If you take away this threat that they're going to be invaded, they're going to stop focusing on building what are essentially deterrent weapons. And that's what they are. And again, North Korea is not going to attack anybody with a nuclear weapon because the result would be instant annihilation. Right. And so I don't have a problem with North Korea having nuclear weapons. I don't have a problem with Iraq having had nuclear weapons, if they ever haven't, and it doesn't look like they did. No. Or Iran getting nuclear weapons. It's actually going to calm things down. That was the excuse when the nuclear club was basically the U.S. and Russia. It was called mutually assured destruction, and we were told this is what kept the world from going into a new world war. Then, of course, Israel stole a bunch of weapons-grade uranium from the United States, started making bombs, started selling them to other countries like South Africa, and for all we know, North Korea is actually getting their nuclear weapons from Israel. We have no way of knowing that's not happening. In fact, one of the clues that we need to look at is when North Korea had their first nuclear weapons test, there was a surveillance aircraft overhead that grabbed samples of the radioactive fallout, and they found it to be an isotopic match with what was called the Vela incident in the South Atlantic, which was thought to be a joint Israel-South African nuclear test. So there are reasons to say that Israel may have sold nuclear weapons to other countries besides South Africa. And actually the South African deal did not go through that anybody is aware of. Or if it did, nobody knows where those nuclear weapons are now.
Oh, that's a little troubling.
Yes.
It's like...
Well,
yeah.
you know, one of the big problems coming out of the Bush administration, remember that big stink about Valerie Plame?
Yes.
And they outed her as a CIA agent
Yeah.
to discredit her husband, who was out there saying that there's no truth to this Iraq buying yellow cake from Niger, and in the process destroyed Valerie's CIA career and the company she was working for, which was actually the CIA's facility for tracking nuclear weapons in the Third World. And they lost all their contacts, all their support, and literally blinded the United States intelligence community from knowing who does and does not have nuclear weapons. It was a reckless, reckless thing to do.
Very much so. I'd like to go on over to Yemen. And it appears that the United States government and military is going to escalate its 2 years war on starving Yemen.
Well, we'll teach those people of Yemen to kick out our imposed puppet ruler. What's wrong with those people?
Yeah.
Once you're conquered, you stay conquered.
And the irony of this is a couple of days after the invasion was started into Yemen 2 years ago, General Lloyd Austin, commander of the U.S. CENTCOM, was asked about the objectives of the U.S. support. And his stunning reply remains the most accurate characterization from a U.S. official. I don't currently know the specific goals and objectives of the Saudi campaign, and I would have to know that to be able to assess the likelihood of success. Other than dropping weapons with an unconscionable lack of discrimination and proportionality, it appears that the goals are no more clear to this day.
Well, that's because they can't admit what the goals really are.
Yeah.
And the U.S. had the same problem in Iraq, where Iraq was sold to the American people about, we've got to get their weapons of mass destruction. They assisted in 9/11.
Yeah.
They're aiding al-Qaeda, all of which turned out to be complete lies. And because they were complete lies, there could never be a perception of U.S. victory in Iraq, because Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons. They were actually ideological enemies with al-Qaeda. And even George Bush later admitted on video, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And so what we have here is a war to reimpose a puppet ruler on Yemen, but that doesn't sound really good to the American people who are being asked to spend their tax money on these wars
and sacrifice their kids
and send their children to be killed and crippled in these wars. And they don't actually have a propaganda cover. They don't have a Maskarova on this one. So that's why he's saying, I don't have a clue what we're doing here, but we're making a heck of a lot of progress.
And I must tell you, and I've got to tell our readers and our listeners, I am profoundly morally uncomfortable that my country, the United States of America, has chosen to be actively complicit in Saudi Arabia's war crimes in Yemen. And make no mistake, folks, these are war crimes of the highest magnitude. The Saudi military is routinely assassinating and maiming Yemeni children with their bombing runs. The Saudi blockade of Yemeni ports has left Yemeni children starving to death of malnutrition. And due to the massive growth of stillbirths, infant deformities, and cancers in Yemen, it's a pretty darn safe conclusion to draw that the Saudis are using depleted uranium weapons here.
And those are terrible. The gift that keeps on giving. The half-life of depleted uranium is 4.5 billion years. And the U.S. is apparently trying to solve part of its radioactive waste problem by turning them into weapons and making it somebody else's radioactive waste problem. And, of course, the problem is the depleted uranium in the weapon, it's a big solid chunk. You can pick it up and throw it in a burial site easily. But once the weapons are actually employed, they vaporize on impact, and it creates this cloud of ultrafine depleted uranium particles that mix in with the soil, and when the wind blows, you breathe them in, and you cannot get rid of them. It's in the food, you eat it, and every place depleted uranium weapons are used, we see this result of massive birth defects following. It's happened in Iraq. It's happening among our veterans returning from the war zones, people who've been exposed to these weapons. I knew somebody who had been a weapons loader for the A-10 attack plane, which uses depleted uranium shells, and he had come on back, and he was a fellow Amiga developer, and he came down with cancer and died. So it is horrific, and we're going to try and raise a little more public awareness about what these depleted uranium weapons are doing Because, I mean, do we not have enough problems with the radiation pouring out of Fukushima and Hanford and Whips and Turkey Point now, 3 Mile Island, all these other places? We're making the problem worse by shoving this stuff all over the planet.
And I've got to tell you, and I've got to tell our readers and listeners, this is one of the most horrific forms of child abuse I can think of. Deforming and poisoning children in the womb through exposure to these weapons, and yet, apparently the Royal House of Saud, the Saudi government, and the U.S. government are perfectly comfortable destroying not only the lives of these children, but the lives of the families as well, because there is no remedy.
No, there isn't. It's a one-way trip. It's a one-way trip. And once the damage is done, there's currently no way to undo it. But remember, according to the corporate media, you should not feel bad about all these deformed children and all these war zones, but please feel really sorry for the victims of the terror attack in London. That's who you should be crying about. But pay no attention to all these other civilian casualties and deformed babies. And we're not buying it. We're offended by this action. It is a war crime. By any reasonable definition, depleted uranium ought to be considered a weapon of mass destruction. Again, because when it's employed, it vaporizes and it spreads and it blows before the wind, and it does basically contaminate everything downwind of the intended target. That's a weapon of mass destruction right there. And
I am profoundly reminded in this obscenely callous disregard for human life, as reflected in these Saudi military tactics, of the comments made by the papal legate at the siege of Montségur against the Cathars. When the guide was informed that not only men were in the besieged castle, but women and children were also there, he said, "Kill them all. God will find his own."
And they made him a saint for that, Saint Dominic.
Oh, boy. And they're talking about U.S. boots on the ground in Yemen and more airstrikes. And the sense I get is that this is going to happen sooner rather than later, unfortunately.
Well, they may just decide to just scrape the place out, and Saudi Arabia will annex it. And meanwhile, of course, the U.S. is building that massive new naval base on that island to basically project power over the entrance to the Gulf. And that nobody's talking about that either.
Socotra, right? Socotra Island?
Socotra Island. And don't bother looking at it in Google Earth, because Google Earth has locked a photo from back in 2004 so that you don't see what's going on over there.
You know, better if you could use a search engine in something like Press TV or Russia Today or Fars News.
I can't imagine that anybody not connected with building the nuclear base is even allowed on the island or over the island at this point. It's apparently was supposed to be a secret. So don't tell anybody, okay, that we told you. Okay? And it's a secret.
Right. And they're bringing in a ton of foreign workers. Apparently no American workers are allowed out there. It's all foreign workers.
Well, I'll bet the Bin Laden family's getting a huge piece of this action.
Oh, probably. Probably.
The Bin Laden family is good buddies with the Bush family. That's why they get all these war zone construction contracts from the U.S. government. Anyway, we've got about a minute and a half before the break. What's next?
This comes out of Global Research and is an article by Stephen Lendman, a gentleman to whom I link frequently because now, Stephen and we have an agreement to disagree on some areas, but he is very powerfully clear and intelligent. Apparently, Russia is now fearful of a U.S. preemptive nuclear attack. And according to Russia's General Staff Deputy Head of Operations, General Viktor Poznikir, the presence of American ABM sites in Europe and ABM-capable ships in the seas and oceans close to Russia's territory creates a powerful clandestine potential for delivering a surprise nuclear missile strike against Russia.
Oh, and small point, all these ABM sites and ABM-capable ships are a violation of the ABM Treaty. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And Claire, what's your next story?
Well, apparently there was an anniversary of sorts of the EU in Rome, which was on lockdown for it. At the event, the communique that was adopted was basically the EU's response to Brexit. The EU is trying to survive as a coalition of nationalistic regimes held together by aspirations to become an aggressive military bloc rivaling the United States.
Now, that's not the majority opinion of the member states of the EU. That's coming out of Brussels.
Right.
And Britain. And to a lesser extent, France, and definitely Germany. But the rest of those countries, they don't want to be a military bloc. They don't want any more war in their front yards.
Yeah. They have a very clear memory of what war feels like, and they don't want to have to deal with it again. And my observation is, Mike, under its current situation, it's unsustainable at any speed. And both Greece and Italy are falling apart so quickly economically as to give one whiplash in watching these economies plunge.
Absolutely. And have you noticed how Cyprus is no longer in the news? They don't want you to know how bad things are over there.
And how bad are they?
They're so bad.
Yeah.
But again, the European Union was created with a built-in self-destruct device called the European Central Bank, another privately owned bank that is allowed to create money out of thin air and loan it into circulation at interest, and it's naturally unstable. You cannot keep it operating over time. It's plunged Europe into hopeless debt, much as the Bank of England plunged the American colonies into debt, because that's what they do. Private central banks are all about enslaving the people with debt, looting their wealth, putting it in the pockets of the bankers. They've been doing it here in the United States for 100 years. They've been doing it in Europe for however long the EU's been around, and everybody's fed up with this because inevitably this practice leads to a war. When governments are so far in debt, they look to loot other people's wealth to pay off their debts, and the banks will actually try and cause wars, because wars will cause countries to borrow even more. There was a movie that came out a while back called The International, and it was based on the world of banking. The storyline was basically that this bank, and it was sort of loosely based on BCCI, was getting involved in small arms manufacturing, and somebody was asking this banking executive why a bank would want to get involved in controlling a conflict. And he says, no, it's not about controlling the conflict. It's about controlling the debt a conflict creates, because that is the thing of value in a war, the debt that it creates that is owned by the bank. And that, here we are again. Countries have finished paying off their debts from World War I and World War II, so of course we're going to start World War III and start the whole scam all over again.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle, and basically it's a giant grinding machine that your children are dropped into the top, and the grinders are turned, and out of the bottom comes money that goes into the bankers' pockets.
Yeah. I'd sort of like to bop on over to Israel right now, and apparently in Israel there will be no early elections. Apparently Netanyahu managed to strong-arm his finance minister and kill a new news broadcast. And he finally reached a deal yesterday with Finance Minister Moshe Kalon that puts an end to a political crisis that threatened to see the government dissolved over a new public broadcaster, senior sources say. According to the deal, the broadcaster's news division will now be dismantled. And earlier this month, the Prime Minister announced he was thinking about a compromise to allow Kan, the new public broadcaster, to launch, but only following enactment of new legislation giving the government more influence over the news authorities.
So you can have a public broadcaster as long as we, the government, tell you what to broadcast. Gee, that sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is really the fact that the Israeli people don't have a pretty more immediate choice on its leadership is a real tragedy. Because in my view, Netanyahu is going to take Israel to war, and possibly to war that it cannot be successful in.
Well, Israel has an escape hatch. They start a war with somebody like Russia, then they stand off to one side and let America come in and finish it up. We've got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And what is your next story, Claire?
Well, a gentleman by the name of Yuval Steinitz, who is Israel's National Infrastructure, Energy, and Water Minister, gave a very interesting interview to the Jerusalem Post, in which he claimed that Iran's traction in Syria is a greater threat to Israel than is ISIS. And he made the statement, it's very easy and convenient to focus on ISIS, he told the Jerusalem Post. But we have two challenges in Syria. One is ISIS, the other is Iran. And the greater threat is coming from Iran, and not just from its nuclear program.
Okay, I'm going to insert right here.
Yes.
I mean, we're
Yeah.
seeing the repeat of this same propaganda tactic that we're
Yeah.
seeing here in the U.S.
Yeah.
Even though the story is completely baseless.
Yeah, fact-free.
Iran's nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Or Russia's Trump connection. They just keep on saying it like it's an established fact. Russia stole Crimea. No, they didn't. Trump and Russia are working together behind the scenes. No, they're not. Iran is building a nuclear bomb. No, they're not. Iran is fully in compliance with that P5+1 agreement. They allow IAEA inspections. They've signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Which Israel has not.
Israel has not, and Israel will not allow IAEA inspections. And still it's Israel out there saying Iran's the nuclear threat, Iran's the nuclear threat. Do a quick tally. Look at how many countries Iran has invaded and attacked over the last, say, a quarter of a century versus how many countries Israel has attacked over the last quarter century versus how many countries the U.S. has attacked over the last quarter of a century. And you'll realize that whatever the problem is with war and strife, it's not Iran. I mean, these days, Israel can't seem to go 6 months without bombing or killing somebody, usually Gaza.
Yeah.
And it is nonsense. And we're literally living in that post-truth world. You know, the facts and the truth don't matter. Just what I can convince you is real, that's what's important. Yeah. It's a world of illusion and perception. It's like everybody in government used to be a nightclub magician, and they're getting by with cards up the sleeves and whatever they can fool you into thinking. And not realizing that most people these days are going on out and finding the truth for themselves. Iran is not a threat to world peace. It's not a threat to Israel. The reverse is true. Israel has made no secret of the fact they want Iran destroyed.
Yeah.
John McCain, who's very good buddy with Israel, wants Iran destroyed. All of these people want Iran destroyed. Iran is not returning the favor. By the way, there's a great video.
Thank you.
That you should hunt down on YouTube. Please don't tell my mother I'm in Iran. And it's actually a documentary made by a Jewish individual who actually went to Iran to find out if it was really the den of iniquities that the media says it is. And what he found is a bunch of people just living their lives, worshiping as they choose, doing business, taking care of their families, just like you and I, ordinary people. And again, it's like this EU Parliament went on down to Syria and discovered that what's going on in Syria is completely different from what the corporate media is putting on out.
Absolutely.
And again, the war hawks, we can tell who's initiating all this war. It's not Iran. Yeah. It's the U.S. and Israel that are, leading the world into a new nuclear world war. And I'll tell you right now, if Israel could find some way to trick the U.S. and Russia into a mutually destructive nuclear war, Israel would come out on top. With their nuclear arsenal, they would control the Middle East, and through the Middle East oil, they would control the world. And you'd better understand that inside Israel's government, they're seriously talking about that as a possibility.
Yeah. And the other thing I notice with the Israeli government, they're constantly trying to put their people, the Israeli people, in a constant state of fear.
Oh, absolutely. If the Israeli people ever calmed down and started thinking, the current government of Israel would be in serious trouble. The same thing is here in the United States. That's why they're ramping up the ISIS booga-booga again. Yeah. They need to keep you afraid of ISIS, keep you afraid of Russia, keep you afraid of the abominable snowman, whatever. But as long as you're afraid, you are emotionally, psychologically dependent on them, and they maintain control.
I remember a statement on this that Marie Curie, the co-discoverer of radium, stated.
Yes.
She said, "Nothing is to be feared. Everything is to be understood." And when you understand the facts and you pull back a little bit and you see what's going on, the state of fear in which the U.S. government is trying to enmesh their own people is a psychological tool.
Again, going back to the Cold War of the 1950s and 1960s, it was constant. It was in the schools. Russia's going to come and get you. The commies are coming to indoctrinate you. The commies have got nuclear. They're going to do this. They're going to do it. It was a constant drumbeat of fear. Be afraid of these people and obey us, and you will be safe. And now they're trying to do it all over again Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
Absolutely.
So there, George W.
I'd like to go over to Bahrain, which is the home of the U.S. Fifth Naval Fleet. Apparently on Wednesday, Secretary of State Tillerson lifted the government's human rights restrictions on arms sales to Bahrain in a move that Amnesty International called galling and a dangerous signal. The State Department notified Congress of its intent to proceed with the sale of F-16 fighters and other weapons to the Gulf Kingdom without the human rights conditions.
Which is kind of hypocritical looking at the United States anyway, which is violating human rights around the world between drone strikes and torture, and it really is a ridiculous situation here. And I wish the United States government had the courage to stand up and say, yeah, we admit it, we're dictators, we're tyranny, we're committing war crimes around the world, you know, and just get used to it. And again, the U.S. will use human rights violations as an excuse to invade other countries and change their government. But if a government of a country that is actually committing human rights violations is friendly to the United States, then no big deal, and here, have some F-16s.
President Trump's administration is beginning to rapidly disappoint me.
I agree.
And right now, looking at this dropping the human rights thing in Bahrain, Trump is well on his way to becoming the AFAB president. Anything for a buck for his defense corporate buddies.
Okay, now, I want to step in here a little bit because what we're seeing, we're hearing about this stuff. It's coming out of the State Department. It's coming out of here, coming out of there.
Yeah.
I think we need to hold open the possibility that Trump is right now overwhelmed with all this Russia nonsense, this Obamagate nonsense, and many of these decisions are actually being made by subordinates that he may not be wholly on board with. We had somebody who called into the show the other day and said much of this warmongering against Russia appears to be originating within NATO rather than the U.S. I would like Donald Trump to put his foot down and actually show us what his real policy is going to be on this, because he did campaign on no more of these foreign U.S. interventions. And if, in fact, Donald Trump is approving these escalations in Syria and selling of the weapons of Bahrain, then clearly this is a campaign promise that he has broken. And yes, I too am very disappointed in him as well. I still maintain that Donald Trump at his worst is still better than Hillary Clinton at her best.
Yes, I would tend to agree. But unfortunately, this sale is a message calculated to give any despot on this planet who are massively suppressing their own people a moment of pure and outright joy.
As long as they're aligned with the U.S. policy. If you're despot oppressing your people and you're not doing business with the U.S., then we're coming to get you.
There was an article I read in What Does It Mean about Russia, and apparently Putin is ordering to draft over 140,000 men into the army this spring. Now, this would not be so worrying because Russia does conscript. However, when it is combined with the following article, again from TASS.com, and I encourage people to read the English language version of this because they're very clear, the conclusions are worrisome in the extreme. Putin has now beefed up the number of his troops in the military to nearly 2 million.
Well, wouldn't you?
I mean, guys.
Let's look at it from Putin's point of view.
Oh,
He's hearing all this Russia bashing coming from the U.S. government. He's seeing all these American war hawks like John McCain openly talking about war with Russia, war with Russia. He's seeing this massive buildup of troops and machinery along the border with Russia. From Putin's point of view, it looks like the NATO is getting ready to invade Russia.
Well, that was my observation with this added troop strength. It appears that Putin, and you and I know he's a great chess player. I bet you'd love to play against him just to see what he could do.
I don't need to be that humiliated. I quit playing chess when my iPhone kept whipping me because I won't accept such upstart behavior from appliances.
But it appears that he's hedging his bets on some kind of a false flag to be blamed on Russia, where NATO just goes in, because NATO it's been like Pac-Man. It's been absorbing these Eastern European countries and placing troops and materials.
They're building a front. to go into Russia, and I'm sure that Putin remembers very clearly how close the Nazis got to Moscow, and he's got no intention of letting that happen again. I don't blame Putin one tiny bit.
Nor do I.
He's being very cautious and very prudent in the face of all of this warmongering by the U.S. and by NATO. He has to understand that he's been an enemy of the West ever since he took direct control of Russia's central bank to run the Russian public currency as a public utility. And by the way, he has doubled Russia's gross domestic product by taking control of the currency. And that, too, is making him an enemy of everyone in the West because, again, if Putin takes control of the central bank and Russia's economy is improving, then everybody else around the world is going to say, well, let's have our government take control of that private central bank and do the same thing that's working for Russia. And, of course, that was the reason everybody ganged up on Adolf Hitler, because he kicked out the private central bank imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles and created a new value-based currency, one that wasn't borrowed at interest from a private central bank. And Germany's economy just lit up. It was called the German Miracle. Time magazine made Hitler their Man of the Year for 1937 because of this amazing transformation where Germany had gone from this country suffering under hideous inflation and poverty and starvation, and all of a sudden it was a manufacturing powerhouse just because he got rid of the private central bank. And, of course, that made him the instant enemy of every other private central bank everywhere on planet Earth. Right. And these private central banks turned around to their governments, who are slaves to the debt, and said, you will go and kill this upstart because we can't have this example in the world. It'll give the ultimate slaves, the ordinary people, uppity ideas about getting rid of private central banking.
Right. And another thing that Russia has chosen to do, which I think is great, they've chosen to be growing non-GMO food, and the world is beating a path to their doorstep for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this dovetails into my next article, which is that EPA chief's refusal to ban brain-damaging pesticide shows profit trumps public safety. And what this guy did, gentleman's name is Pruitt, defying the recommendation of his own agency's scientists. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt has refused to ban a widely used pesticide that has been linked to learning disabilities in children. Pruitt's order, signed late Wednesday, allows chloropyrifos, an organophosphate insecticide that's been used on crops from broccoli to cranberries since the 60s, to remain on the market for agricultural use. The EPA proposed in November of 2015 under the Obama administration to permanently ban the chemical on food crops, citing potential risks to human health. The move stemmed from a 2007 petition filed by the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Pesticide Action Network North America. This makes me very uncomfortable. Anything that is linked to learning disabilities in children, it shouldn't be anywhere near the food chain. But as consumers, we have the absolute right to protect ourselves and those we love from these harmful chemicals. Now, wherever you buy your vegetables, take a note of what company produces them. Call them and find out if those veggies or fruits are sprayed with, help me out with this, chloropyrifos or glyphosate. Glyphosate. And persist politely in these phone calls until you get an answer one way or the other. Go back to where you buy your fruits and vegetables and politely tell them that you no longer can buy them because they are sprayed with harmful chemicals which have been proven to cause brain damage in children.
Well, here's the problem. We've reached a point right now where it's almost impossible to find any food that isn't contaminated with these toxic chemicals, all in the name of maximizing profitability. And it's another sign of just how incredibly corrupt our entire establishment has become, where concerns about safety and health just aren't a factor. We have literally devolved to a society in which if it makes money, it's good. If it's not making money, it's bad, and there are no other considerations. I was just looking on the Fox News feed here, and even they're talking about this epidemic of opioid abuse, and they're talking about prescription opioid abuse, where doctors and pharmacies are prescribing this stuff and selling it, knowing it is addicting, and knowing that once they can get a patient hooked on it, the money will continue to flow forever. And frankly, I'm having a really hard time finding the line between the illegal drug industry and the legal drug industry.
I hear you. I hear you, dear.
Okay.
And that kind of leads into my next article. There is a new law which was passed very quietly in December, which means you could be the subject of a vaccine or medication experiment without your informed consent.
Yeah, we talked about this one a little while ago, and basically up until this law, the idea was that you, if you were going to be a subject for a medical test of any kind, the doctor, practitioner had to sit down with you and say, we're going to be trying out something new on you. We think it may do this. It could also have these negative impacts. Is it okay if we proceed? And you could say yes or no. This new law is basically a gift to the pharmaceutical industry to test on people without their knowledge. Yeah. Because the new law is that the informed consent is waived if it's determined that the experimental drug or treatment poses only minimal risk to the patient.
But how do they know that, Michael?
Well, apparently it's up to the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors to decide. There is no actual definition of what they consider minimal risk, you know, and they could be experimenting with a drug that causes your arms to fall off, but that's a minimal risk because you're still going to have your legs. And, you know, carried to an extreme. Again, look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment to see what these people can do. We're going to take a break for commercials. Back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Actually, don't call. The lines are still closed. This is our last segment of the program today on this Pauhana Friday here. We're going to do a couple more stories and then do our sign-off here. Your next story.
This comes to us from Zero Hedge, and it's titled The Ticking Time Bomb That Will Wipe Out Virtually Every Pension Fund in America. And it talks about people thinking that they're secure with their pensions. And Bloomberg apparently published an editorial entitled Pension Crisis Too Big for Markets to Ignore. And what it did was it simply confirmed what a lot of people already knew to be true. Apparently, pension funds all over this country are terribly underfunded, and they have been pouring mind-boggling amounts of money into very risky investments, such as investment stocks and commercial mortgages. Just like the subprime mortgages of 2008, this is a crisis that everyone can see coming, and there's nothing that seems to be getting done about it.
Well, here's the problem, okay? Yeah. Pension funds are constrained by law against getting into investments that appear to be risky. And if they're investing in risky investments, it's because somewhere there's a rating agency that has said, no, this is not risky, this is AAA. And we saw this happen during the mortgage-backed security fraud in 2008, where Wall Street's rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and all the rest of those, except for Egan-Jones, who got shut down, we're all saying these are AAA. These mortgage bundles are AAA. The fraud imploded, and pensions that had invested in these supposedly AAA investments were left without funds. And because nobody has the courage to stand up and point the finger at Wall Street, what's been going on is the pension funds are now having to reduce payments to these workers who spent their lives paying into the pension funds, and now they're not getting back the money they need for the retirement they thought they were planning for. And the problem is apparently still continuing. And it really is... we're at the end of this Ponzi scheme. And unfortunately, I feel really bad for our fellow baby boomers who are about to realize their pensions are on the verge of collapse. The money in Social Security you thought was going to be there for your retirement has been borrowed away by a government that doesn't have a snowball's chance in the dark regions, chance of ever paying it back. And it is a crisis, and unfortunately, as is always the case under fascist economic dictatorships, The pain is always going to be dropped on the most vulnerable segment of our society, which in this case are the elderly people. Yep. They're just going to be thrown out of their homes, and we're going to have a whole new elderly homeless population in the streets, and they're going to be at risk. And maybe that's how they're going to solve the problem. Cut off the pensions, put them out in the streets, let them die off from exposure, sell the bodies for the fertilizer plants or wherever they do with the dead homeless people, and problem is solved. But unfortunately, we have seen this coming on for 100 years, ever since the private central bank was created, and we've certainly seen it accelerating for the last 30 years with the loss of our manufacturing, and certainly with that GMO disastrous experiment. Okay, there's the music. It's time for us to get on out of here. So we're going to say goodbye. Have a good weekend. Again, please share what you learn on this radio show and our website with everybody that you know. We need to shout down the paid liars, the prostitutes, the correspondents, the propagandists who are trying to take us back to a world of illusion and post-truth in order to control us. We'll be back on Monday. Aloha, America.